Welcome back to Pursuing God's Heart Yourself in the book of Jonah. We're in part 3, and in part 3, the principle that we're going to think about is this one right here. It's the recognizing the type of writing that you're reading. Wherever you are in the Bible, if you can recognize the type of writing, is this a narrative, is this poetry, is this direct communication like a letter or speech or something, it will help you to make sense of what you're reading. Now, most of Jonah is a narrative. A narrative is made up of characters, and those characters are living, experiencing a plot. And so sometimes we will draw a plot line like this. Just saying, look, here's an inciting incident, something that creates a tension. That tension then rises as the plot progresses, and eventually we get to a moment where things get resolved. And so that's the way stories work. You're looking at the characters, you're watching the tension develop, you're wondering what's going to happen. In this first chapter of Jonah, you had the plot of the storm. Jonah running away from God. What's going to happen? Well, there's this storm. The ship's threatening to break up. Are they going to survive? They try to row and so on. And eventually the storm stops when Jonah's thrown into the sea. So you've got the plot, but you've also got the characters. You've got these pagan, non-Jewish sailors who you don't really expect much from at all. And by the end of it, they surprise you by vowing vows and sacrificing sacrifices to the Lord, all capitals, to Yahweh. At the same time, you've got the prophet of the Lord, Mr. Jonah himself, who seems to be doing everything wrong, running away from God, hiding, sleeping, not telling them what's going on, all of this kind of weird stuff. In the midst of it, he declares, I fear the Lord, but his actions seem to say otherwise. Well, anyway, he gets thrown into the sea, the storm stops, God shows mercy to those sailors, but then he also shows mercy to Jonah, because as Jonah is sinking down into the sea, darkness is closing in over him. He's expecting at any moment to take his last breath and just fill his lungs with salt water and pass away. In that moment, God sends the great fish to swallow him. Just one verse, just a brief reference. There isn't a great kind of play on the sensationalizing of that unique situation. If this was a legend or a myth, you'd expect all sorts of creativity, but it just states it as a fact. He's swallowed by this fish that God appointed. And so then in chapter 2, instead of a continuation of narrative, we now have Jonah's prayer from inside the fish in the form of poetry. And poetry is made up typically of pairs of lines where the second line completes the first, and you see the imagery, you see the kind of sense being communicated in a slightly different way. What do you notice in chapter 2? We're not going to look at all of it because I want you to read it and to see it for yourself, but you'll notice that Jonah's recognizing that God has rescued him. You'll notice that he's describing what happened to him. I mean, when we're most moved emotionally, we tend to communicate in poetry, and I would imagine almost drowning is quite a moving experience. And so there's all sorts of description and recognition of what God has done. But what's missing in chapter 2 is any recognition of why it happened, any recognition of what Jonah did to put himself into that situation, to create that problem. He never says it was my fault. He never says I was wrong. He never says I am sorry. What we get at the end of it is these last couple of verses. And let's just look at them kind of as a capstone, really, for what's going on here. He says this: those who pay regard to vain idols forsake their hope of steadfast love. Who are those who pay regard to vain idols? Could be thinking forward to Nineveh, or to where he was ultimately called to go and was resisting. He hates them, he hates their idols. They don't deserve steadfast love. Yeah, could be that. He could be thinking about the sailors. Maybe he was disgusted or disappointed with the sailors and their little kind of seafaring idols and, you know, all their own god stuff that was going on last time he was up there on top of the water, on top of that ship with them. Maybe he's describing them. But we've got this contrast here where he says, but I. Here he is inside the stomach or whatever of a great fish, a stinky environment in the dark. And yet he's declaring that he, with the voice of thanksgiving, will sacrifice to you. What I have vowed, I will pay. Salvation belongs to the Lord. Now, this, of course, is absolutely true. It's true that salvation belongs to the Lord. He can say this in a way that very few others can, because he's literally come within a breath of dying, and God's rescued him. He's been delivered. What a gracious act of mercy that was from the Lord. But it's interesting when you kind of think about these lines here. I will sacrifice to you. What I have vowed, I will pay. He's looking forward with some sort of confidence, some sort of faith, to doing these things in the future. Now, it may be that he's genuinely speaking from a sort of humbled position, and he's anticipating with trust that if God has rescued me by getting me in this fish, he'll get me out, and I'm going to go and I'm going to do the right thing. Or it could be that he's speaking with a sense of arrogance, unlike those terrible pagans up on that ship who have all their own gods. I am going to sacrifice. I am going to vow. Now, of course, the irony would be that what he doesn't know is that after his disposal from the ship, after he was hurled into the sea and sank down, what happened up above was instant calm, and then the sailors, fearing the Lord exceedingly and making a sacrifice to the Lord and vowing vows to the Lord. He doesn't know any of that. He thinks that maybe he is in the more spiritual position, but actually, ironically, they've been worshipping God while he's been coming to terms with being inside a fish. All sorts of things going on here, but it's interesting how the writer of Jonah switches from narrative when telling the story of the storm to poetry to express the emotional impact inside Jonah. Now, whether Jonah's in a good place, he's not in a good place, he's in a fish, but in terms of himself, whether he's in a good place or not, we'll just leave that as an open question. Jonah just seems to create all sorts of questions for us as we progress through the story. And so come back again next time. We're going to look at another passage in Jonah. We're going to look at another principle, and we're going to continue to pursue God's heart for ourselves. That's the goal of this series. Thanks so much for joining us.